"You don't want to see what's underneath," she said, and the mountain man looked her in the eye and answered, "Show me everything." Snow falls heavy in the high country. A scarred hermit offers shelter to a widow who hides more than her face. Beneath her shawl are scars carved by violence, and a secret she's been running from. But when soldiers thunder up the trail, demanding what she carries, the mountains shake with danger. Because this woman holds something no one expected, an old treaty that could change the fate of an entire people. The sheriff wants her silenced, the law calls her a liar, and the only man standing in her way is the very one who swore he'd never fight again. In a town where justice bends to power, scars will be bared, secrets exposed, and the line between shame and courage tested in fire. Will the mountain man's promise to see everything be strong enough to protect the woman no one else will defend? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through the cabin's single window, snow fell in heavy flakes, casting strange shadows in the lamplight. Sandro stood motionless, his scarred hands still gripping the back of the wooden chair where he'd been about to sit. The sound from below came again, a soft shuffle, then silence. Kathy's eyes, dark and fearful, met his. "Please," she whispered. "He's all I have left." Sandro's throat tightened. He knew that tone, the desperate edge of a mother's protection. Slowly, deliberately, he moved away from the trapdoor and settled into the chair, making sure Kathy could see his every movement. "How old?" he asked softly. 8 summers. Her fingers twisted in her shawl. "His name is Samuel." The lamp flickered as wind whistled through the cabin's chinks. Outside, the snow was building up against the walls, but inside, the iron stove kept the chill at bay. Sandro studied Kathy's face in the warm light. The scars that marked her skin told one story, but the steel in her spine told another. "Reckon he's mighty cold down there," Sandro said carefully. "And hungry too, I'll warrant." Kathy's shoulders tensed. "We've managed." "No doubt." Sandro stood slowly, watching how she shifted to keep herself between him and the trap door. "But there's soup warming on the stove, and I've got cornbread from yesterday." He moved to the rough-hewn cupboard, speaking as he worked. "My mama taught me never to let anyone go hungry in my home." A flicker of surprise crossed Kathy's face. "Your mother?" "Creek woman," he said simply, setting 2 tin bowls on the table. "Taught me more than just cooking." He ladled the thick bean soup into the bowls, added generous chunks of cornbread, then stepped back. "There's plenty more." Understanding dawned in Kathy's eyes. Sandro wasn't just offering food, he was offering trust. She knelt beside the trap door, tapping twice on the wooden planks. "Samuel," she called softly, "you can come up now." The trap door lifted slowly, and a small face peered out. The boy's eyes were large and wary in his thin face, but there was a quickness to his movements that spoke of strength beneath the fear. He climbed out with the careful grace of someone used to moving quietly, staying close to his mother's side. "Evening, Samuel," Sandro said, keeping his voice gentle. "Mighty cold night to be under the floor." The boy didn't answer, but his eyes fixed on the steaming bowls. Sandro pulled out chairs for both of them, then retreated to his own seat by the stove. He watched as Kathy guided her son to the table, noting how she tasted the soup first before letting him eat. Samuel ate carefully at first, then with increasing speed as hunger won out over caution. Kathy ate more slowly, her eyes constantly moving between her son and Sandro. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of spoons against tin. When Samuel finished his bowl, Sandro wordlessly ladled more soup for him. The boy hesitated, looking to his mother for permission. At her nod, he began eating again, this time pausing between bites to study Sandro's face. "Your face," Samuel said suddenly, making both adults start. "It's like Mama's." "Samuel," Kathy warned, but Sandro held up a hand. "It's all right," he said. "He's right. We both carry our stories on our skin." He touched the rippled scar tissue that covered the left side of his face. "Mine came from a fire 5 years back. Lost my cabin and most everything in it." Samuel nodded solemnly. "We lost things too." He glanced at his mother, then down at his bowl. "But Mama says what matters is still here. Your Mama's a wise woman." Sandro reached for the coffee pot, pouring a cup for Kathy. "And she's right. Things can be rebuilt." Kathy wrapped her hands around the warm cup, her fingers trembling slightly. "Some things can't." "No," Sandro agreed quietly, "but new things can grow in their place." He stood carefully, moving to add another log to the stove. "Storm's setting in hard. You'll stay the night, of course." It wasn't really a question, but Kathy stiffened anyway. "We shouldn't—" "Mama," Samuel interrupted, his voice small but determined. "I'm tired of running." The words hung in the air like frost. Kathy's face crumpled for just a moment before she regained control. Sandro busied himself with the stove, giving her time to compose herself. "There's a bed in the back room," he said finally. "Clean blankets, too. I'll sleep out here by the stove." When Kathy started to protest, he added, "Got to keep the fire going anyway, with weather like this." Samuel yawned, and Kathy's resistance visibly wavered. "Just for tonight," she said finally. "We'll be gone before dawn." Sandro nodded, though something in his chest ached at the thought. He showed them to the small back room, bringing extra blankets and his spare shirt for Samuel to sleep in. The boy was already half asleep on his feet, the warmth and full belly doing what weeks of fear and cold had not allowed. As Kathy tucked her son into the narrow bed, Sandro lingered in the doorway. "I've got coffee still hot, if you'd like to sit a spell," he offered. "Might help ward off the cold." She hesitated, looking down at Samuel's peaceful face. Then she nodded, following Sandro back to the main room. They settled in chairs by the stove, the coffee steam rising between them like unspoken words. "Whatever you're running from," Sandro said carefully, "it won't find you here tonight." Kathy's hands tightened around her cup. "You don't know that?" "No," he agreed, "but I know these mountains, know every trail and hollow, know how to keep what's mine safe." He met her eyes steadily. "And tonight, that includes you and Samuel." The lamp guttered, shadows dancing across their scarred faces. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside, something fragile and warm began to take root. Kathy didn't speak, but her shoulders gradually relaxed, and when Sandro added more wood to the stove, she didn't flinch at his movement. They sat in companionable silence, two scarred souls finding unexpected shelter on a snowy night, while in the back room, a boy slept peacefully for the first time in many weeks. The storm raged on outside, but within the cabin's walls, something like hope had begun to stir. Sandro knelt beside the trapdoor, his movements slow and deliberate. The worn iron handle felt cold against his palm as he carefully lifted the heavy wooden door. Lamplight spilled into the darkness below, revealing a small figure huddled in the corner of his root cellar. Samuel Yazzie pressed himself against the earthen wall, wrapped in threadbare blankets. A half-eaten biscuit, hard as stone, lay beside him. The boy's dark eyes were wide with fear, darting between Sandro and his mother like a trapped rabbit's. "It's all right, son," Sandro said softly, reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out a strip of jerky, holding it out like he would to calm a spooked horse. "Reckon you might be hungry for something more than that old biscuit." Kathy moved closer to the trapdoor, her hand resting protectively on the wooden frame. "Samuel," she whispered, "come up where it's warm." The boy hesitated, studying Sandro's scarred face. Something in Sandro's gentle expression must have reassured him, because he slowly uncurled from his defensive position. His small hands gripped the ladder rungs as he climbed up, accepting the jerky with trembling fingers. "Thank you, sir," Samuel murmured, the words barely audible. He pressed close to his mother's side, but his eyes stayed fixed on the dried meat. "Call me Sandro," the mountain man said, closing the trap door. He turned to the iron stove where the bean soup still simmered. "Let's get some real food in you both." As he ladled the hot soup into bowls, Kathy's voice came quiet but steady. "The townsmen call him illegitimate." Her arms tightened around Samuel's shoulders. "They say my marriage wasn't proper. That's why we keep him hidden." Sandro's jaw clenched, but he kept his movements calm as he set the bowls on the table. Anger wouldn't help them now. "Proper enough for me?" he said simply, pulling out chairs for them both. "Eat while it's hot." The wind howled outside as they ate, snow pelting against the shuttered windows. Samuel finished his first bowl quickly, and Sandro wordlessly filled it again. As the boy ate, some color returned to his cheeks, and his shoulders gradually relaxed. Kathy stirred her soup slowly, as if gathering courage. "My husband," she began, her voice soft but clear, "was a scout for the army at Fort Garland. Apache, like my mother's people. He believed in building bridges between worlds." Sandro nodded, remembering the stories he'd heard of native scouts trying to prevent bloodshed through diplomacy. Too often their efforts had been betrayed. "Before he died," Kathy continued, "he signed a treaty. It promised our people water rights at Canyon Spring." Her hand moved to her chest, where something crinkled beneath her clothes. "I carried the deed, wrapped in oilskin. It's all we have left of him now." "The sheriff, Drummond, he says I have no rights to it." Her voice hardened. "Says a half-breed woman can't hold treaty land. He and the army men from the fort, they've been hunting us since autumn." Samuel looked up from his bowl, fear creeping back into his expression. "They hurt Mama," he whispered. "When they found us at the mission." Sandro's hand tightened on his spoon, but he kept his voice steady. "You're safe here," he said. "Both of you." The fire popped and settled in the stove. Outside, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Night pressed dark against the windows, and Samuel's eyes were growing heavy. "You'll stay tonight," Sandro said. It wasn't a question. "Weather's too fierce to be moving about." Kathy's face showed her internal struggle. "If they track us here—" "Then they'll find more than they bargained for," Sandro interrupted quietly. "I know these mountains better than any fort soldier or town sheriff, and I don't take kindly to men who hunt women and children." He stood, gathering extra blankets from his storage chest. "The boy needs real sleep, not hours crouched in a root cellar." Samuel was already swaying with exhaustion. Kathy looked at her son, then back at Sandro. Finally, she nodded. "Just for tonight," she said. "We've caused you enough trouble already." "No trouble," Sandro replied, laying out the bedding near the hearth. "My mother would have my hide if I turned away folks in need." He helped them arrange the blankets, making sure Samuel would be warm enough. The boy curled up like a young wolf pup, asleep almost instantly. Kathy sat beside him, running her fingers gently through his dark hair. The fire burned lower as the night deepened. Sandro added another log, watching the flames catch. Snow continued to beat against the cabin walls, but inside, the air was warm and still. "Get some rest," he told Kathy. "I'll keep watch." She looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable in the firelight. "Why are you helping us?" Sandro touched the scars on his face unconsciously. "Because someone once helped me," he said simply, "when I had nothing left but burns and bitter memories." Kathy nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. She settled down beside Samuel, one hand still resting protectively on his shoulder. Soon her breathing deepened into sleep. Sandro sat in his chair by the stove, rifle across his knees. The hours crept by like molasses. Occasionally he rose to add more wood to the fire, his movements careful and quiet. Each time he checked the windows, though the snow made it impossible to see more than a few feet. Dawn arrived reluctantly, seeping gray light through the gaps in the shutters. The storm had eased, but heavy clouds promised more snow to come. Sandro watched the pale morning creep across the cabin floor, knowing it brought more than just another winter day. It brought decisions, dangers, and perhaps something else, something neither he nor his unexpected guests had dared hope for in a long time. Morning crept over the mountains, pale and brittle as old bone. Frost had worked its way across the cabin windows overnight, leaving delicate patterns that sparkled in the weak winter light. Sandro stood at the door, studying the pristine snow that blanketed the ridge. No tracks yet, but that wouldn't last long. He gathered his traps from the shed, the metal cold enough to bite through his leather gloves. As he headed toward the tree line, small footsteps crunched in the snow behind him. Samuel followed, wrapped in one of Sandro's old wool blankets, his dark eyes bright with curiosity. "Want to learn about trapping, do you?" Sandro asked, slowing his stride so the boy could keep up. Samuel nodded, his breath making little clouds in the frozen air. "Mama says we need to learn how to provide for ourselves." "Your mama's a wise woman." Sandro knelt in the snow, showing Samuel how to set the first trap. "See here? You want to place it where animals naturally travel, along these fallen logs, or between these two trees." The boy watched intently as Sandro demonstrated the proper technique, his small face serious with concentration. They worked their way along the tree line, setting traps in likely spots while Sandro explained the signs of rabbit runs and deer paths. When they returned to the cabin, warmth and the smell of cooking greeted them. Kathy stood at the iron stove, her shawl drawn tight despite the heat. She was making corn cakes, the batter sizzling as it hit the hot griddle. "Smells good," Sandro said, helping Samuel shake the snow from his boots. Kathy nodded, her movements precise as she turned the cakes. "It's not much, but it's what I can offer in return for your kindness." Before they ate, Kathy drew Samuel close. She spoke softly in Apache, teaching him a prayer of thanksgiving. The musical words filled the cabin, foreign to Sandro's ears but beautiful in their reverence. Samuel repeated each phrase carefully, his young voice blending with his mother's. The peaceful moment shattered at the sound of approaching horses. Hoofbeats echoed up the ridge, sharp and threatening in the winter quiet. Sandro moved to the window, his hand finding his single-action rifle where it rested by the door. "Under the bed," he told Samuel quickly. "Stay quiet as a mouse." The boy disappeared just as 4 riders came into view. 3 wore the blue uniforms of Fort Garland soldiers, their breath steaming in the cold. The 4th was Sheriff Drummond, his badge catching the pale sunlight as he dismounted. Sandro stepped onto his porch, rifle held ready but not aimed. The morning light threw his scars into stark relief as he faced the men. Behind him, he could hear Kathy's quick breathing as she stood in the doorway. "Morning, gentlemen," he said evenly. "Long ride from town." Sheriff Drummond spat into the snow. "Save the pleasantries, Harker. We're here for the squaw and her brat. Got reports they've been seen heading this way." "The lady you're referring to is under my protection," Sandro said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is my property, Sheriff. You've got no cause to be here without a warrant." One of the soldiers shifted in his saddle. "That woman's carrying stolen property, army business, not civilian." "I stole nothing," Kathy said from the doorway. Her voice trembled but held steady. "The treaty deed was my husband's, given freely for his service. It's mine by right." "Rights?" Drummond laughed harshly. "You've got no rights here, woman. That paper's army property. and you'll hand it over or face the consequences. Sandro took a step forward, placing himself more firmly between the men and Kathy. Seems to me any proper documentation of ownership could be settled in court, not at gunpoint on private land. You defending her claim, Harker? Drummond's hand rested on his holstered pistol. Didn't figure you for an Indian lover. I'm defending the law, Sandro replied. The same law that badge on your chest says you're sworn to uphold. Now, unless you've got a warrant, I suggest you ride back to town. The standoff stretched long and tense. Sandro's finger rested beside his rifle's trigger, not on it, not yet. He could feel Kathy's presence behind him, solid as a mountain. Somewhere in the cabin, Samuel held his breath. Finally, Drummond yanked his reins, turning his horse. This ain't over, Harker. We'll be back with that warrant, and then neither your scars nor your rifle will stop us taking what we came for. The men wheeled their horses around, snow flying from their hooves as they rode down the ridge. Sandro waited until they were out of sight before lowering his rifle. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Inside the cabin, Samuel crawled out from under the bed, his eyes wide. Kathy gathered him close, whispering soft words in Apache while he trembled. Sandro moved quickly, gathering boards he kept for repairs. With practiced movements, he began securing the cabin door and windows. Each nail he drove felt like a prayer, for protection, for wisdom, for the strength to face what was coming. When the cabin was as secure as he could make it, he knelt by the stove. Eyes closed, head bowed, he offered up silent prayers he hadn't spoken since the fire that scarred him. Prayers his mother had taught him, about justice and mercy walking hand in hand. Evening settled over the mountain like a heavy blanket. They ate the remaining corn cakes in silence, all too aware of how the day's events had changed things. Samuel played quietly by lamplight with some wooden figures Sandro had carved years ago, his shadow dancing on the cabin walls. Kathy watched her son, then turned to Sandro. I haven't trusted a white man since my husband died, she said softly. He believed in bridges between peoples. Paid for that belief with his life. Sandro nodded, understanding in his scarred face. Trust's harder to build than bridges. Takes longer to repair when broken, too. Yet here you stand between us and harm. Kathy's fingers worried at her shawl. Your scars, they speak of pain, but also survival. There's an honesty in that I can't ignore. The lamp flickered, making shadows dance across her face. For a moment neither spoke, letting the weight of trust beginning to form settle between them like newly fallen snow. Samuel's quiet play and the crack of burning wood filled the silence. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, carrying the promise of another storm. But inside the cabin, something fragile and new was taking root, something that might, with care and courage, grow strong enough to weather whatever tomorrow might bring. Morning brought a subtle shift in the weather. The bone-deep cold gave way to a gentler air that turned pristine snow into gray slush. Water dripped from pine branches, each drop catching brief sunlight before falling. Sandro stood on his cabin porch, surveying the changed landscape. Behind him, he heard Samuel's footsteps pattering across the wooden floor. Ready to learn something new today? Sandro asked, turning to face the boy. Samuel nodded, more eager than yesterday. His dark eyes held less fear now, though wariness still lurked in their depths. Come on then, I'll show you how to catch rabbits without using steel traps. Sandro gathered some thin rope and a few straight branches he'd stored in the lean-to. They walked together through the melting snow, their boots making sucking sounds in the slush. Sandro chose a spot where rabbit tracks crisscrossed beneath a thicket of mountain laurel. Watch careful now, he said, kneeling beside Samuel. First, we need to make a loop, just so. His scarred hands worked the rope with practiced ease, forming a perfect snare. Samuel leaned closer, his breath making little clouds in the cool air. Like this? He tried to copy Sandro's movements with his smaller fingers. That's right, Sandro encouraged. Now we set it just high enough for a rabbit's head. He demonstrated how to secure the snare to a flexible branch, bending it down and anchoring it carefully. As they worked on setting a second snare, Samuel's hands grew more confident. When the loop settled perfectly into place, a sound burst from him that startled them both. Laughter, bright and unexpected as spring water. The sound warmed something in Sandro's chest that had been cold for years. He found himself smiling, his scars pulling tight with the unfamiliar expression. From the cabin doorway came a soft movement. Kathy stood watching them, her shawl looser around her shoulders than usual. Though her posture remained alert, ready to call Samuel back at any sign of danger, some of the rigid fear had eased from her frame. They spent the morning setting more snares, Samuel growing more animated with each success. His questions came faster now, curiosity overwhelming his initial silence. Sandro answered each one patiently, feeling something long dormant stirring in his heart. When they returned to the cabin, Kathy had beans simmering in the iron pot. The warm smell filled the small space, making it feel more like a home than it had in years. Over supper, Sandro finally asked the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Tell me about this spring of your peoples." Kathy's hands stilled on her tin plate. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Canyon Spring has been sacred to my mother's people since before the Spanish came. The water there flows year-round, clean and sweet. It gives life to the entire canyon, plants for medicine, shelter for deer and elk, water for our crops." She paused, stroking Samuel's dark hair. "But now the settlers want it for their cattle. They say the treaty means nothing because my husband—" Her voice caught. "Because Samuel's father is gone." Setting aside her barely touched plate, Kathy reached beneath her clothing and withdrew an oilskin packet, worn smooth by constant carrying. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it on the rough-hewn table. The treaty paper was creased but carefully preserved. Sandro leaned forward, studying the formal script by lamplight. His eye caught on a familiar signature at the bottom. Colonel James Barrett. "I knew Barrett," he said quietly. "Served under him before." His hand lifted unconsciously to his scarred face. He was a man of his word. If he signed this, he meant it to stand. "The sheriff claims it's worthless now." Kathy's voice held both bitterness and fear. "If they find it, they'll destroy it, without proof of our rights." She drew Samuel closer to her side. Evening deepened outside the cabin windows. The lamp cast warm light on the walls as Kathy began humming softly, an Apache lullaby, its melody ancient and soothing. Samuel's eyes grew heavy as he leaned against her shoulder. Sandro watched them, feeling the weight of something he'd thought forever lost. Family, home, the simple comfort of shared space and trusted presence. The melody faded into silence. Samuel dozed by the banked fire, his face peaceful in sleep. Kathy's eyes met Sandro's across the quiet room. "The fire that marked me," Sandro said slowly, the words coming with difficulty. "It took more than just my skin. Lost my wife, my little girl. Couldn't save them." His throat tightened. "Afterwards, couldn't bear to see myself. Came up here to hide away." Kathy nodded, understanding in her dark eyes. "We both hide underneath," she whispered. Her hand touched her shawl, then dropped away. "My scars, they're from the same night they killed my husband. I fought back." Her voice held pride mixed with old pain. "But sometimes I still feel their hands." They sat in silence, sharing the weight of their revealed wounds. Something shifted between them, a recognition, a tentative trust born of shared suffering and survival. Samuel stirred in his sleep, murmuring something in Apache. Kathy smoothed his hair, her touch gentle. The simple gesture spoke of all she protected, all she had endured to keep him safe. Sandro moved to the window, rifle across his knees. Outside, the thawed snow was freezing again as temperature dropped with nightfall. His reflection in the dark glass showed his scars clearly, but for the first time in years, he didn't flinch from the sight. He settled in to keep watch, aware of Kathy's steady presence behind him, of Samuel's quiet breathing, of the precious trust they had placed in his protection. The night stretched ahead, but he was no longer alone in his vigilance. The days melted one into another, like snow dripping from pine boughs. A quiet rhythm settled over the cabin as January deepened. Each morning Sandro shouldered his axe and headed into the forest, the steady thunk of splitting wood echoing across the ridge. Samuel, growing bolder, carried water from the stream in a small bucket, careful not to spill a drop. Inside, Kathy's nimble fingers wove strips of old cloth into patterns, creating a simple rug that brought color to the worn floorboards. The routine felt almost like peace, though they all knew it couldn't last. One frosty morning, when the sun turned every ice-coated branch into crystal, hoofbeats sounded on the path. Sandro grabbed his rifle, but the approaching figure wore a black coat and carried no weapons. The Reverend Josiah Miles pulled his horse to a stop, breath frosting in the cold air. "Morning, Sandro," the preacher called softly, dismounting with care. His eyes moved past Sandro to where Kathy stood in the doorway, Samuel half hidden behind her skirts. Recognition flickered across the Reverend's weathered face. "Sister Kathy," he said, his voice catching, "I hadn't thought to find you here." Kathy's spine stiffened. Her hand tightened on Samuel's shoulder. "Reverend Miles?" she answered, her tone careful and distant. Sandro looked between them, sensing old hurt in the air. "You two know each other?" "Perhaps we might speak inside," Reverend Miles asked, rubbing his cold, reddened hands together. "What I have to say shouldn't be heard by passing wind." Inside the cabin, Samuel fed kindling to the fire, while the adults settled around the rough table. The preacher removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I need to speak with Kathy alone, if I may," he said quietly. Sandro glanced at Kathy, who nodded slightly. He took Samuel outside to check the rabbit snares, leaving the two in privacy. When the door closed, Reverend Miles seemed to shrink in on himself. "I owe you an apology, Sister Kathy. One long overdue." "For what?" Kathy asked, though her eyes said she already knew. "After your husband died, when you came to me in secret, asking for baptism." The preacher's voice grew hoarse. "I christened you in the creek at midnight, like some shameful thing. Then when the townspeople turned against you, I stayed silent. I failed you." Kathy's hands twisted in her shawl. "You were afraid?" "Yes." The admission seemed to pain him. "Afraid of losing my position, my congregation's respect. I chose the easier path, to my shame." He met her eyes directly. "Can you forgive me?" The silence stretched long between them. Finally, Kathy spoke, her voice tight but steady. "My people say that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." She drew a deep breath. "I forgive you, Reverend, but not for you. For myself and for Samuel." Relief softened the preacher's face, though guilt still shadowed his eyes. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather-bound book. "I've kept records of every baptism, including yours, and I've heard talk in town. The sheriff means to claim the springs soon, saying there's no proof of your rights." Kathy's face paled. "The treaty dash." "Yes, that's why I came." Reverend Miles leaned forward earnestly. "Bring it to town. Let me help prove its validity before corruption buries the truth forever. My testimony combined with the document itself." Sandro and Samuel returned then, bringing with them a blast of cold air and the smell of pine. The boy carried 2 rabbits from their snares, proud of the morning's success. Throughout the evening meal, tension hummed beneath the surface of ordinary actions, Samuel fell asleep by the fire as the adults spoke in low voices, weighing risk against necessity. "It's too dangerous," Kathy insisted, lamplight catching the worry in her eyes. "The sheriff and his men are counting on our fear to keep us silent," Sandro finished. "The Reverend's right. We can't hide forever." "You don't understand." Kathy's voice cracked. "I've seen what happens when men choose sides. My husband trusted their promises once. His blood soaked into the ground while they watched. This time will be different," Reverend Miles said quietly. "I won't be silent again." Outside, wolves began their nightly chorus, their howls echoing off the mountainsides. The sound carried both beauty and menace, like all wild things. Kathy looked down at Samuel, peaceful in sleep. Her fingers traced the edge of the oilskin packet that never left her possession. "If we do nothing, he'll inherit only bitterness and hiding," she whispered. "Like his mother." Sandro touched her arm gently. "You're not hiding anymore." "Neither am I." Finally, Kathy nodded. "Tomorrow, then, but tonight let him sleep safe one more time." The Reverend left soon after, promising to prepare the way in town. Sandro and Kathy sat long into the night, planning, worrying, remembering. The lamp burned low as they talked, casting their shadows large against the walls. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the frost-rimed windows, Sandro was already in the barn, saddling his horse. The animal's breath made clouds in the cold air as he checked the cinch one final time. From the cabin doorway came the sound of Kathy's voice, soft and bitter. "Look, Samuel," she murmured to her son. "Once again, men will choose sides against us." Her arms tightened around the boy as she watched Sandro prepare for the journey ahead. The morning sun rose fully over the ridge, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of rose and gold. It would have been beautiful, if not for the fear that lay heavy as iron in their hearts. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-packed trail as 3 figures made their way down from the mountain. Sandro led on his bay horse, scanning the path ahead with watchful eyes. Behind him, Kathy sat straight-backed on a borrowed mare. Samuel held close against her chest. The boy's eyes were wide, taking in the distant rooftops of the town he'd only glimpsed from hiding. Their horses' hooves crunched through the crusty snow, each step measured and careful on the steep descent. The treaty papers rustled softly beneath Kathy's shawl, precious as life itself. "Stay close," Sandro called back quietly. "Remember what we planned." Kathy nodded, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Samuel pressed closer to her warmth, his small hands clutching her dress. As they approached the outskirts of town, the first curious faces appeared in windows. A woman sweeping her porch stopped mid-motion, broom frozen in her hands. 2 men loading a wagon paused to stare, their whispers carrying in the crisp winter air. That's the Apache woman. Thought she'd left these parts. What's Harker doing with her kind? Kathy kept her eyes forward, though Sandro noticed how her shoulders tensed at each new voice. They passed the general store, where Mrs. Peterson pulled her young daughter inside, the bell jangling harsh and sudden. Samuel flinched at the sound. The sheriff's office sat squat and gray at the end of the main street, its windows reflecting the morning light like suspicious eyes. Sandro dismounted first, helping Kathy and Samuel down with gentle hands. He tied their horses to the hitching post, movements deliberate and unhurried. "Ready?" he asked softly. Kathy straightened her spine, one hand protective on Samuel's shoulder. "As I'll ever be." The floorboards creaked beneath their boots as they entered. Sheriff Drummond sat behind his desk, boots propped up, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. He looked up lazily. Then his expression hardened as he recognized them. Well, well, the mountain hermit and his pet squaw. The sheriff's voice dripped with contempt. "Come to surrender peaceful-like?" Come to claim what's rightful, Sandro answered evenly. Kathy holds a legal treaty, signed by Colonel Matthews himself. It guarantees water rights at Canyon Spring to her people. Drummond's laugh was ugly. That worthless piece of paper? Probably forged by some reservation drunk. Samuel pressed closer to his mother's skirts as the sheriff stood, his chair scraping back. Sandro's hand tightened on his rifle strap, but he kept his voice steady. We want witnesses. The whole town should see the truth of it. Truth? Drummond spat the word. Only truth here is you harboring fugitives, Harker. Ought to lock you up too. The door opened behind them, bringing a rush of cold air. Reverend Miles stepped in, his black coat dusted with snow. I believe I can help with witnesses, the preacher said quietly. The congregations gathered at the church, waiting to see justice done. Drummond's face darkened, but with townsfolk already involved, he couldn't simply dismiss them. Fine, he growled. Let's see this famous treaty of yours. The short walk to the church felt endless. People lined the boardwalks, watching silently as their strange procession passed. Samuel stumbled once on the icy ground, but Sandro caught his arm, steadying him. Inside the church, every pew was filled. Lamplight gleamed on curious faces, some hostile, some uncertain. The Reverend took his place at the pulpit, gesturing for Kathy to join him. She climbed the steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the hushed space. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached beneath her shawl, withdrawing the oilskin packet. The familiar motion of unfolding it steadied her somewhat. This treaty, she began, her voice soft but clear, was signed by Colonel James Matthews in the spring of 1873. It guarantees the water rights of Canyon Spring to my husband's people, the White Mountain Apache. She held up the document, its official seal catching the light. A ripple of gasps and murmurs moved through the congregation. Reverend Miles stepped forward to examine it. The Colonel's signature matches others I've seen, he confirmed, and the seal is genuine. Before he could say more, the church doors burst open. Boots thundered on wooden floors as soldiers poured in, rifles ready. Sheriff Drummond smiled coldly from the doorway. Seize that paper, he ordered. It's evidence in a fraud investigation. No! Kathy clutched the treaty to her chest, but a soldier wrenched it from her grasp. Another shoved her roughly aside. Sandro surged forward, fury in his scarred face. You have no right! The rifle butt caught him across the temple with a sickening crack. He staggered, blood trickling down his face as more soldiers forced him back. Mama! Samuel's terrified cry cut through the chaos. He tried to run to Kathy, but Drummond caught him by the collar. Samuel! Kathy's scream tore from her throat as she fought to reach her son. Let him go! Kathy Yazzie, Drummond announced with satisfaction. You're under arrest for trespassing on federal land and attempting to defraud the United States government. He shook Samuel slightly. The boy, too. Can't have him running wild. The congregation erupted in confused voices. Some stood, protesting the rough treatment. Others nodded grimly, prejudice winning over conscience. This isn't right, Reverend Miles called out. That treaty was legal. Was it? Drummond's voice cut through the noise. Funny how it disappeared so quick, almost like it never existed. The soldier who'd taken it was nowhere to be seen. 2 more men grabbed Kathy's arms, dragging her toward the door despite her struggles. Samuel sobbed, reaching for her as Drummond hauled him along. Stop this! Sandro tried to rise, blood matting his hair, but another blow sent him sprawling in the aisle. Get him out of here, Drummond ordered, and if he causes more trouble, there's room in the cells. Rough hands seized Sandro, pushing him through the church doors and out into the gathering dusk. He stumbled, caught himself against a post, and looked up in time to see a wagon rattling down the street. Through its wooden slats, he glimpsed Kathy holding Samuel close, her face wet with tears. Kathy, he called hoarsely, I'll find you. I swear it. but the wagon disappeared around a corner, taking with it all their fragile hopes of justice. Sandro sagged against the post, blood dripping onto the snow at his feet. Around him, townspeople hurried past, avoiding his eyes as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Night settled over the town like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a bone-deep chill. Sandro lay where he'd fallen, his face pressed against the frozen mud outside the church steps. Blood from his temple wound, mixed with the dirt, and his vision swam each time he tried to rise. Footsteps crunched in the snow beside him. A gentle hand touched his shoulder. "Mr. Harker." Reverend Miles's voice was thick with shame. "Let me help you up." Sandro struggled to his knees, accepting the preacher's steadying grip. His head throbbed where the rifle butt had struck him. Together they made their way slowly through the darkened streets, the Reverend supporting much of Sandro's weight. "My wife Sarah will tend to those wounds," Miles said softly. "It's the least we can do." The parsonage sat behind the church, a modest house with warm lamplight glowing in its windows. Sarah Miles met them at the door, her kind face creasing with concern at the sight of Sandro's bloody temple. "Bring him to the kitchen," she directed, already gathering clean cloths and her medicine box. "The light's better there." Sandro sank into a chair by the cook stove, its warmth doing little to ease the cold fear in his gut. While Sarah cleaned his wounds with gentle hands, Reverend Miles paced the kitchen floor, wringing his hands. "I should have spoken sooner," the preacher burst out. "Should have stood up when they first started harassing Kathy after her husband died. Instead, I baptized her in secret and kept quiet when the trouble came." Sarah pressed a cool cloth against Sandro's temple. "Hold that there," she instructed, before turning to mix a poultice. "You're speaking now," Sandro said roughly. "That's what matters." Miles stopped pacing. "There's more." He hurried from the kitchen, returning moments later with a thick, leather-bound book. "My church ledger. I kept copies of certain documents, including treaty records." Sandro straightened, wincing at the movement. "What kind of records?" "Witness statements, land grant details, even a copy of Colonel Matthews' original survey map showing Canyon Spring on Apache territory." The Reverend's fingers trembled as he opened the ledger. "I told myself I was just being thorough, but truth is, I knew someday the proper authorities might need proof." "Today's that day." Sandro stood, ignoring Sarah's protests about his wounds. "Those papers could free them." "The fort commander's an honest man," Miles said. "If we show him these records, prove the treaty was real. Then we ride at first light." Sandro's voice was iron. "I won't leave them in that jail one day longer than necessary." Sarah finished binding his temple with clean bandages. "You'll sleep here tonight," she said firmly. "Both of you need rest before such a journey." But sleep proved elusive. Sandro lay on the parsonage's spare bed, his thoughts with Kathy and Samuel in their cell. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Samuel's terrified face, heard Kathy's scream as they were torn apart. Miles wasn't sleeping either. Sandro could hear him moving about downstairs, gathering supplies for their ride to Fort Garland. The preacher's guilt had finally found its purpose in action. In the holding cells near the fort, Kathy sat on a narrow cot with Samuel curled against her side. The boy had cried himself into an exhausted sleep, but still trembled occasionally. She stroked his hair, humming softly, an Apache lullaby her mother had once sung to her. The cell was small but clean, with a barred window that showed a slice of star-filled sky. Cold seeped through the stone walls despite the wool blanket they'd been given. Kathy wrapped it tighter around Samuel, leaving her own shoulders bare to the chill. "Shi Yaji," she whispered in Apache. "My little one, be strong." Her fingers found the empty place beneath her shawl where the treaty had been. All those years protecting it, keeping it safe, only to have it snatched away in moments. But they couldn't steal her memories of her husband's words as he'd signed it. This paper is our children's future. Sandro's voice echoed in her mind. Show me everything. She'd revealed her scars that first night, expecting rejection. Instead, he'd offered shelter, protection, and something more. Understanding, trust, the beginnings of hope. He'll come for us, she murmured to Samuel's sleeping form. That man keeps his promises. Through the window, she watched the stars wheel slowly overhead, marking time until dawn. Morning brought heavy snow clouds and bitter wind. Sandro and Reverend Miles set out early, their horses' hooves breaking through crusted snow. The preacher's saddlebags held his precious ledger, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. They rode in silence, each man lost in thought. The road to Fort Garland stretched 15 miles across open country, winding through patches of pine forest and across frozen streams. By mid-morning, snow began falling in earnest. "Storm's getting worse," Miles called over the wind. "We should find shelter." Sandro nodded grimly. He knew these mountains, knew how quickly a snowstorm could turn deadly. After another mile, he spotted what they needed, an old line shack used by cattle hands in summer months. They led their horses into the relative warmth of the crude stable attached to the shack. Inside the main room, Sandro found dry wood stacked by a small iron stove. Soon, a fire crackled welcome heat into the space. Miles shed his snow-covered coat, then carefully removed his ledger from the saddlebags. He sat near the stove, turning pages with reverent care. "Listen to this," he said. "I, Colonel James Matthews, do hereby affirm that the waters of Canyon Spring, being within the traditional territories of the White Mountain Apache people, shall remain under their sovereignty in perpetuity." He looked up at Sandro. "It's dated the same day as Kathy's treaty." Sandro stared into the fire. "Will it be enough?" "Truth usually is." Miles drew a small Bible from his coat pocket. "Reminds me of Proverbs. The truthful lip shall be established forever." "Seems to me truth needs some help getting established sometimes," Sandro said quietly. "Needs men willing to stand behind it." The preacher's hands tightened on his Bible. "I aim to stand this time." No more hiding in silence. They shared a simple meal of jerky and hard biscuits, listening to the storm howl outside. As afternoon drew on, the snow began to slacken. "Tell me about them," Miles said suddenly. "Kathy and Samuel, help me know them better." Sandro was quiet for a long moment. "Samuel's quick to learn, watches everything with those serious eyes of his, but he's starting to laugh again, to trust." He added another log to the fire. "And Kathy, she's stronger than anyone I've known. Carries her scars like badges of survival, not shame. Teaches her boy to be proud of who he is." "You love them," the preacher said softly. It wasn't a question. "Reckon I do." Sandro's scarred face was thoughtful in the firelight. "Found family where I least expected it." Miles nodded slowly. "Then we'll see them free. Whatever it takes." The two men sat in companionable silence as darkness gathered outside. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight they had warmth, purpose, and the strength of shared conviction. In the stove, the fire burned steady and bright, like the hope they carried. The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the barred window of the holding cell at Fort Garland. Kathy sat on the narrow cot, pressing a cool cloth to Samuel's forehead. His cough had worsened through the night, each raspy breath tightening the knot of fear in her chest. "Just a little longer, Shiyaji," she whispered, smoothing his dark hair. "Stay strong." Heavy boots echoed down the corridor. Two officers appeared, accompanied by the sheriff who had arrested them. The taller officer, a lieutenant with a thin mustache, unlocked the cell door. "Come with us," he ordered. The commander wants to question you." Kathy gathered Samuel in her arms, his small frame burning with fever. The boy whimpered, burying his face in her shawl. They were led down a series of cold hallways to a sparse office where a gray-haired captain sat behind a broad desk. "Sit," he commanded, not looking up from his papers. The sheriff took up position by the door while the lieutenant stood at attention beside the desk. Kathy settled into a wooden chair, keeping Samuel close. "You claim ownership of Canyon Spring through a treaty," the captain stated flatly. "Where is this supposed document?" "Your men took it," Kathy replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But it bears Colonel Matthews's seal and signature." The lieutenant sneered. "An Apache woman has no legal standing to hold property rights. Everyone knows that." "My husband was a scout for the army," Kathy said. "He signed the treaty legally with witnesses." "A convenient story," the captain said, "since your husband isn't here to verify it." He finally looked up, his pale eyes cold. "For all we know, you forged the document." Samuel's cough broke the tense silence, his small body shaking with the force of it. Kathy rubbed his back, fighting to keep her composure. "My son is sick," she said. "The cell is too cold." "You should have thought of that before trespassing on government land," the sheriff cut in. A commotion erupted in the outer office. Raised voices carried through the door, one deep and familiar. Kathy's heart leaped as Sandro burst in, followed by Reverend Miles. "I demand to speak with the commanding officer," Sandro declared, his scarred face set with determination. The captain rose, anger flashing across his features. "This is a restricted area." "Sir," Miles stepped forward, clutching his leather ledger. "I have documents that prove the legitimacy of Mrs. Yazzy's claim." "More forged papers?" the lieutenant scoffed. "Official records," Miles corrected, opening the ledger. "I kept copies of all treaty documents, including Colonel Matthews' original survey and witness statements." The captain studied Miles carefully. "You're the circuit preacher?" "Yes, sir." "These are my church records, dating back 5 years. Miles laid the open book on the desk. "Including the day the treaty was signed." Curiosity warred with irritation on the captain's face. After a long moment, he sighed. "Very well. We'll hold a proper hearing. Tomorrow morning." "Samuel needs medical attention now," Sandro insisted. The captain waved dismissively. "The fort doctor can examine him. But they remain in custody until this matter is settled." As guards led Kathy and Samuel back to their cell, Sandro caught her eye. The silent promise in his gaze gave her strength. Word spread quickly through the fort and nearby town. By morning, the makeshift courtroom, normally used as the fort's mess hall, was crowded with curious onlookers. Townsfolk whispered among themselves as Kathy was brought in with Samuel, who leaned heavily against her, face flushed with fever. The fort doctor had given him medicine the night before, but his cough persisted. Sandro and Reverend Miles sat nearby, the preacher's ledger open before them. The captain presided from a hastily arranged desk, flanked by 2 other officers. "Present your evidence," he commanded. Miles stood, explaining how he had recorded the treaty signing and kept copies of all documents. He read Colonel Matthews's survey description aloud, pointing out the clear designation of Canyon Spring as Apache territory. The lieutenant interrupted. "That's all very interesting, but it doesn't prove this woman has any right to the land. Where's documentation of her marriage? Proof of inheritance?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Kathy felt their stares like physical weight on her shoulders. Samuel trembled against her side. Slowly, deliberately, she stood. "You want proof?" Her voice carried clearly through the suddenly hushed room. "Here is your proof." With steady hands, she unwrapped her shawl. Gasps echoed as she revealed her scarred arms and shoulders, testament to the violence she had survived. "These marks," she said, "they came from men who tried to drive us from our land after my husband died. Men who thought they could shame me into running away. Her chin lifted. I have nothing left to hide. I will not be silenced. The room fell deathly quiet. Even the lieutenant looked away, unable to meet her steady gaze. Townswomen who had once shunned her now watched with dawning understanding in their eyes. Several men shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering their own roles in past harassment. Samuel's weak cough broke the silence. Kathy gathered him closer, speaking again more softly. My husband died protecting our rights to that spring. I keep fighting for our son's future, for all our children's futures. Sandro stood, his scarred face reflecting fierce pride. The treaty is legal. The preacher's records prove it. Will you uphold the law, Captain? The captain's expression was unreadable as he studied the scene before him. Finally, he cleared his throat. This hearing is dismissed. I will review the evidence and render judgment later. But sir, the lieutenant protested. That will be all, the captain said firmly. As guards led Kathy and Samuel back toward their cell, something had shifted in the crowd's demeanor. Where before there had been hostile stares, now she saw thoughtful faces, troubled frowns, even nods of respect. God be with you, an older woman called softly. Others added their voices. We'll pray for your boy. This ain't right. Something must be done. Sandro watched them go, his hands clenched into frustrated fists. Beside him, Reverend Miles gripped his Bible tightly. The truth is out now, the preacher said quietly. They can't ignore it forever. Sandro's jaw set. They better not try. His eyes followed Kathy until she disappeared down the corridor, her head held high despite everything, still protecting her sick child with fierce dignity. The townsfolk filed out slowly, their usual chatter subdued. Many stopped to speak with Reverend Miles, asking questions about the treaty, expressing concern for Samuel's health. The morning's revelations had shaken loose old prejudices, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about their community. In their wake, the makeshift courtroom stood empty, except for Sandro and Miles. Through the windows, winter sunlight cast long shadows across the floor, like bars of a different kind of prison. One built of ignorance and fear, now beginning to crack. Dawn broke bitter cold over the fort, frost etching delicate patterns on the windows. In the parsonage, Sandro paced before the stone hearth, while Reverend Miles studied his worn Bible, both men seeking a path forward. The captain won't be swayed by moral arguments alone, Miles said, closing the book. We need more voices speaking for Kathy's cause. Sandro paused, his scarred face thoughtful. The ranchers, he said. They water their herds at Canyon Spring. Exactly. Miles stood, warming his hands by the fire. If the army seizes control, those cattle operations will suffer. Self-interest might motivate them where conscience hasn't. Reckon that's worth trying. Sandro grabbed his heavy coat. Which homesteads first? The Hendersons run the largest herd, Miles replied. Start there. I'll visit the Wilsons and meet you at the Crawford place by noon. They saddled their horses and rode out, breath clouding in the frigid air. Hooves crunched through crusted snow as they split up, each taking different trails across the vast rangeland. At the Henderson ranch, Sandro found old Jim Henderson in his barn, checking on a pregnant heifer. The rancher listened with growing concern as Sandro explained the situation. Never thought much about that Apache woman's claim, Henderson admitted, scratching his gray beard. But if the army takes over... He shook his head. My cattle need that water. Been using it 15 years now. The treaty protected everyone's access, Sandro said, including yours. But if they void it? They could charge fees. Or cut us off entirely. Henderson's weathered face hardened. Count me in. I'll testify at the hearing. Similar conversations played out across other homesteads. Miles found the Wilsons equally receptive once they understood their stake in the matter. By noon, when the men met at the Crawford place, momentum was building. 5 ranchers pledged support so far, Miles reported, as they warmed themselves with coffee in the Crawfords' kitchen. Plus their hands will spread the word. Mary Crawford, a plain-spoken woman who ran the ranch since her husband's death, joined them at the table. "That spring's kept our stock alive through 3 droughts," she said. "Army can't just take it. Ain't right." Meanwhile, at the fort, Kathy knelt beside Samuel's cot in their cell. His skin burned with fever as she pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, whispering prayers in Apache. The boy's cough had worsened overnight, each breath a painful wheeze. "Shiaji," she murmured, using the tender term for my child. "Stay strong." Footsteps approached. Kathy tensed, but it was only Private Wilson, the young guard who had shown them kindness. He glanced down the corridor before quickly passing 2 extra blankets through the bars. "Town's talking," he whispered. "Folks are starting to see things different since yesterday. Even my ma said it wasn't Christian, keeping a sick child locked up." Kathy wrapped Samuel in the fresh blankets, grateful for their warmth. "Thank you," she said softly. The private nodded, then hurried away as other boots echoed nearby. That afternoon, Sandro rode past his homestead. Smoke still rose from the blackened ruins where soldiers had burned his cabin. The sight twisted his gut, years of work reduced to ashes. But watching that gray column rise against white mountains, he felt not defeat, but determination. When Kathy and Samuel returned, they would rebuild together, make something stronger than before. As evening approached, Miles rang the church bell. People began gathering, drawn by word passed through town all day. Ranchers stood alongside merchants. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid Kathy now sat in pews, faces troubled by conscience. Lamplight cast long shadows as Miles opened his Bible. "Listen to these words from the prophet Amos," he began, "but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Heads nodded. Jim Henderson stood. "We've been wrong, turning blind eyes while injustice was done. That spring belongs to all of us, Apache and settler alike. The treaty made it so." "Amen," several voices called. Mary Crawford spoke next. "My ranch depends on that water. But more than that, my conscience can't bear seeing that boy sick in a cell while we debate his mother's rights. It's time to make this right." Other ranchers rose to pledge support. Even the shopkeeper who had once refused to serve Kathy admitted shame. "We'll stand with her at the hearing," he declared. "All of us." Sandro watched from the back, his scarred face glowing in the warm light. Hope began to kindle in his chest, not just for justice, but for healing deeper wounds between peoples. He thought of Samuel's laugh while learning to set traps, of Kathy's quiet strength as she revealed her scars. They had shown him what family could mean again. The meeting continued as darkness fell outside. Plans were made, testimonies prepared. One by one, the townspeople committed themselves to standing for truth. When they finally dispersed into the cold night, their resolve seemed to warm the very air. Miles approached Sandro as the last lantern was extinguished. "God works in mysterious ways," the preacher said. "Sometimes it takes a child's illness to open hard hearts." "Samuel will recover," Sandro replied firmly. "And when he does, he'll find a changed town waiting." "Yes," Miles smiled. "Though there's still a battle ahead. The captain won't surrender easily." "No." Sandro's jaw set with determination as they stepped into the starlit night. "But neither will we." The frozen ground crunched beneath their boots as they walked toward the fort, where lamplight still burned in the commander's office. Tomorrow would bring another confrontation. But tonight, the foundation for justice had been laid, not in force of arms, but in changed hearts and awakened conscience. In her cell, Kathy felt it too, a shift in the very air, like spring winds beginning to thaw winter's grip. She held Samuel close, humming softly as he slept fitfully. Outside their window, the stars wheeled overhead, ancient and patient, watching as truth slowly worked its way toward light. The first pale light of dawn crept over the eastern horizon, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold. A procession of wagons creaked along the frozen road toward Fort Garland, wheels crunching through crusty snow. Breath steamed from horses' nostrils in the bitter morning air as townspeople and ranchers made their way to the hearing. Jim Henderson's wagon led the group, his large frame wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat. Behind him, Mary Crawford drove her own rig, her chin set with determination. More followed, the Wilsons, the shopkeeper and his wife, ranch hands and merchants who had never before shown interest in Apache affairs. Inside the fort, Kathy sat on the edge of her cot, wrapping Samuel in every blanket they had. The boy's fever had broken during the night, but his face remained pale, dark circles shadowing his eyes. She smoothed his hair back, humming softly. "Today we stand strong, Shiaji," she whispered. "Like your father would." Heavy boots approached their cell. 2 soldiers appeared with Private Wilson, who gave them an encouraging nod as he unlocked the door. "Time for the hearing, ma'am." Kathy lifted Samuel into her arms, holding him close as they were led through cold stone corridors to the fort's main hall. Morning light streamed through high windows, falling across wooden benches already filling with people. At the front, a long table had been set up where the commanding officer would preside. Sandro stood near the entrance, his scarred face tightening with concern when he saw Samuel's weakness. He stepped forward as if to help, but Kathy shook her head slightly. They had to show strength now, not dependency. She carried her son to a front bench, settling him carefully beside her. The room grew quiet as Captain Harrison entered, his blue uniform crisp despite the early hour. Sheriff Drummond slouched against a wall nearby, his badge gleaming dully in the morning light. The captain took his seat, shuffling through papers with deliberate slowness. "This hearing will now commence," he announced, "regarding the disputed claim to Canyon Spring water rights." Sandro moved to the center of the room, his voice steady and clear. "Sir, I present evidence supporting Mrs. Yazzy's treaty rights." He held up Reverend Miles' leather-bound ledger. "These are certified copies of the original documents, showing her late husband's signature and the Army's seal." The captain accepted the ledger, examining it with narrowed eyes. Behind him, the sheriff shifted restlessly, spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. Jim Henderson stood next, his weathered face serious. "Captain, my family's ranched this territory 15 years. That spring's water has sustained our herds through every drought. The treaty protected everyone's access, Apache and settler alike. It's worked fine until now." Other ranchers rose to speak, Mary Crawford describing how the spring saved her stock during the terrible summer of 1876, the Wilsons confirming how the water sharing had fostered peace between peoples. Their words carried weight, representing the territory's largest cattle operations. The sheriff pushed off from the wall suddenly. "This is foolishness," he barked. "We're listening to ranchers defend a squaw and her brat. Harker here's been harboring them illegally, probably warming his bed with—" The crowd erupted in angry murmurs. Several ranchers half rose from their seats, faces darkening. Even the captain looked disturbed by the crude accusation. Before anyone could speak, Kathy stood. Her movements were deliberate as she unwrapped her shawl, letting it fall away completely. Gasps rippled through the room as her scarred arms and shoulders were revealed in the morning light. But she held herself tall, unflinching under the stares. "My husband," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "fought for this country. He served as an Army scout, leading soldiers through Apache lands, building trust between peoples." Her dark eyes swept the room. He bled for that trust, and when he signed this treaty it was more than just his mark on paper. It was a covenant between nations. She touched Samuel's shoulder gently. This land has seen enough violence. The spring gives life to all. My people's sheep, the ranchers' cattle, the town's gardens. The treaty honored that truth. Will the army now break faith with a man who died in its service? Captain Harrison's face showed conflict as he studied the ledger again. The sheriff's accusations had backfired, lending dignity to Kathy's cause rather than shame. The townspeople's support was clear, and the ranchers represented significant political influence. This matter requires, the captain began carefully, review by higher command. The documentation appears genuine, but proper channels must be— Enough! Sheriff Drummond lurched forward suddenly, face mottled with rage. He seized Kathy's arm roughly, fingers digging into her flesh. You're still under arrest, treaty or no treaty. Several things happened at once. Samuel cried out in fear. Ranchers surged to their feet, and Sandro moved like lightning, his fist connecting with the sheriff's jaw in a sharp crack that echoed through the hall. The sheriff staggered back, losing his grip on Kathy. She stumbled away, clutching Samuel close as chaos erupted. Drummond recovered and charged at Sandro, both men grappling in a furious struggle. Soldiers pushed through the crowd, trying to separate them. Stand down! Captain Harrison's voice cut through the chaos. Guards, restore order! Blue-uniformed men formed a line between the sheriff and Sandro, who stood breathing heavily, blood trickling from a split lip. Drummond wiped his bloody nose, eyes burning with hatred. The captain's voice was steel. This hearing will recess until proper review of the treaty can be conducted through military channels. Sheriff Drummond, you will release Mrs. Yazzie and her son to await that review under town supervision. Under whose supervision? The sheriff demanded. Mine. Mary Crawford stepped forward. My ranch has plenty of room, and I'll stand surety for them. Other ranchers quickly added their support. The captain nodded, clearly relieved to find a temporary solution that would satisfy both law and conscience. So ordered. This hearing is adjourned pending further review. The sheriff stormed out, shoving past townspeople. The crowd began to disperse, talking in excited whispers about what they'd witnessed. Kathy remained standing, one arm around Samuel, watching the captain gather his papers. They were not free yet. The treaty's fate still hung in balance. But something had shifted. The wall of silence and shame had cracked. Sandro approached carefully, his scarred face gentle despite the fresh bruises. You all right? Kathy nodded, drawing her shawl back around her shoulders slowly, deliberately, not hiding now, simply staying warm. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. Mary Crawford joined them, her practical manner comforting. Let's get this boy somewhere warm. My place has good soup and soft beds. She smiled at Samuel, who managed a tired grin in return. They left the fort together as morning sun filled the valley. The wagons that had brought the townspeople now waited to escort them to the Crawford ranch. Behind them, the fort's flag snapped in the winter wind, and somewhere in the high command, wheels of justice would begin turning. But for now, they had one breathing space, time for Samuel to heal, for truth to work its way forward, for hope to grow stronger than fear. The iron bars of their cell felt colder than before, as Kathy cradled Samuel against her chest. His small body burned with fever, face flushed and breathing labored. She pressed her cheek to his forehead, her heart clenching at the dangerous heat she felt there. Yazzie, she whispered, rocking him gently. My little one? Her voice lifted in a soft, Apache lullaby, though it caught in her throat as Samuel shivered despite the blankets wrapped around him. Private Wilson had brought extra quilts, his young face troubled as he watched the boy's condition worsen. The holding cell, though dry, held winter's chill in its stone walls. Samuel's cough had deepened over the past day, each breath now a worrying rattle. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, Sandro's distinctive gait, quick with urgency. He appeared at the bars, his scarred face tight with concern. "How is he?" he asked softly, gripping the iron with white-knuckled hands. Kathy shook her head, tears threatening. "The fever rises. He needs medicine, Sandro." "I'll fetch the fort doctor," he promised, already turning away. His boots rang against the stone as he hurried out. Kathy resumed her song, an old healing melody her mother had taught her, though her voice trembled more with each verse. Samuel stirred restlessly, mumbling words she couldn't catch. She drew him closer, willing her own warmth into his shaking body. Time stretched like cold molasses until Sandro returned with Dr. Matthews, the fort's physician. The elderly doctor stood stiffly outside the cell, medical bag clutched in one hand. "I have my orders," he said, not meeting Sandro's eyes. "Prisoners receive basic care only." "Basic care?" Sandro's voice roughened with anger. "He's a child burning with fever. Look at him. The regulations are clear." "Regulations?" A new voice joined them. Reverend Miles, his normally gentle tone sharp with disappointment. "Dr. Matthews, I've known you 20 years. You delivered half the children in town. Would you deny medicine to any of them?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "This situation is different." "Is it?" Miles stepped closer, speaking low but intense. "We share the same God, Doctor. The same calling to heal and comfort. What would Christ say about regulations that let a child suffer?" Matthews's shoulders sagged slightly. He glanced through the bars at Samuel's flushed face, then down at his medical bag. "I suppose I could spare some willow bark tea for the fever, and perhaps some beef broth to keep up his strength." "Thank you," Miles said quietly. "You do honor to your profession." The doctor nodded curtly, then opened his bag and began pulling out packets of dried herbs. He passed them through the bars to Kathy, explaining in clipped tones how to prepare the tea. Private Wilson was summoned to bring hot water and broth from the fort's kitchen. Sandro stayed close to the bars as Kathy mixed the willow bark tea. His hands, rough from years of mountain work, were surprisingly gentle as he helped her lift Samuel's head, supporting the boy while she coaxed small sips between his cracked lips. "Easy now," Sandro murmured. "That's it, son. Just a little more." Samuel swallowed weakly, but didn't wake fully. Still, after the tea and some spoonfuls of warm broth, his breathing seemed to ease slightly. The terrible rattle in his chest softened. Kathy pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, watching his face anxiously for any change. As evening approached, word of Samuel's illness spread through the fort and into town. People gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices about the sheriff's rough handling of a sick child and his mother. Mary Crawford's offer of shelter seemed increasingly sensible compared to the cold cell. More townspeople began appearing at the commanding officer's quarters, some bearing written petitions, others simply asking to speak their piece. Jim Henderson's wife brought a basket of fresh-baked bread and preserves, insisting it be given to the prisoners. The Wilsons' daughter arrived with warm socks she'd knitted herself. Private Wilson, moved by the show of support, made sure these gifts reached Kathy and Samuel. He also reported that several of the fort's own soldiers had expressed unease about the situation, particularly after witnessing the sheriff's violent outburst at the hearing. As night fell, Sandro was forced to leave the cell block for the barracks where he'd been assigned temporary quarters. The narrow cot was hard and cold, but he barely noticed the discomfort. His thoughts remained with Kathy and Samuel, his prayers a constant whisper in the darkness. "Lord," he murmured, "give them strength. Give me wisdom to help them. Don't let that boy—" He couldn't finish the thought. The barracks gradually grew quiet as other soldiers settled into sleep. Outside, snow began falling, thick flakes drifting past the windows. The soft shushing sound seemed to muffle all other noises, creating an otherworldly silence. Back in the cell, Kathy kept her vigil. Samuel's fever had dropped slightly with the medicine, but she dared not hope too much yet. The winter night pressed against the small window, bringing memories of other cold vigils, other fears. "Sandro will help us," she whispered to Samuel, smoothing his dark hair back from his damp forehead. "He's a good man, Shiaji, strong and true like your father was." Her voice caught. "He sees past the scars, past the fear. He sees us." Samuel stirred slightly at the sound of her voice. "Sandro," he murmured, the name barely audible before he slipped back into uneasy sleep. Kathy pulled the blankets higher around him, adding her shawl for extra warmth. Through the window she could see the steadily falling snow, its white curtain softening the harsh lines of the fort's buildings. The flakes danced like spirits in the darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, she knew Sandro was praying for them. The night deepened. The fort's usual sounds, marching feet, officers' calls, the blacksmith's hammer, all faded beneath winter's gentle blanket. Even the guard's footsteps seemed muffled as he made his rounds. In that hushed world, Kathy kept her lonely watch, counting Samuel's breaths, mixing fresh willow bark tea whenever he stirred, and holding on to hope with both hands. She found herself humming another song, one her mother had sung during long winter nights, a prayer for protection, for guidance, for the strength to endure until dawn. The ancient words felt right in this modern stone cell, bridging worlds just as she herself did, just as Samuel did, just as Sandro, with his scarred face and gentle heart, had bridged the distance between stranger and family. The snow continued falling, and somewhere in the fort, Sandro slept fitfully, his dreams full of a small boy's smile and a woman's quiet courage. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, the snow wrapped them all in its silence, holding them in this moment of waiting, of hoping, of prayer. Dawn broke over Fort Garland with golden fingers of light stretching across the snow-covered parade ground. Inside their cell, Kathy held Samuel close, his fever finally broken though weakness still lingered in his small frame. The sound of hurried boots on stone made her look up, heart pounding. Private Wilson appeared first, keys jangling in his hands. Behind him came the commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, his face unreadable as he unfolded an official document. Sandro and Reverend Miles rushed in moments later, their breath clouding in the cold morning air. "Mrs. Yazzie," Colonel Harrison began formally, "word has arrived from higher command regarding your claim." He cleared his throat. "After reviewing the evidence presented in Reverend Miles's ledger and examining your treaty deed, command has ruled that your claim is lawful and binding." Kathy's grip on Samuel tightened as the colonel continued. "The United States Army will honor the treaty as written. Canyon Spring and its surrounding lands are recognized as rightfully belonging to your people, with full water rights as specified in the original document." A cheer erupted from the corridor, where townsfolk had gathered to hear the announcement. Mary Crawford pressed forward, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Jim Henderson's wife clutched her husband's arm, smiling broadly. Private Wilson's hands shook slightly as he fitted the key into the lock. The cell door swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to echo Kathy's own relief. She stood slowly, supporting Samuel against her side. Sheriff Drummond pushed through the crowd, his face dark with anger. "This ain't right," he spat. "You can't just—" "The matter is settled, Sheriff," Colonel Harrison cut him off sharply. "By order of command. Unless you wish to dispute the Army's authority." The sheriff's scowl deepened, but he fell silent, his hands clenching uselessly at his sides. Sandro stepped forward, his scarred face transformed by joy. He wrapped his arms around both Kathy and Samuel, holding them as if he might never let go. Samuel pressed his face into Sandro's buckskin coat, while Kathy allowed herself to lean into his strength for the first time, truly trusting. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder, "for believing in us." But then she straightened, gently disentangling herself from his embrace. Her eyes swept the gathered crowd, taking in their faces, some friendly, some still uncertain, all watching. With deliberate movements, she unwound her shawl, letting it fall away from her shoulders. "Look," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed corridor. "Look at these scars. They are not marks of shame, but witness to survival. My husband died defending this land, this water. I lived to carry his promise forward. These scars tell that story, of loss, yes, but also of strength, of endurance." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mary Crawford stepped forward, tears still wet on her cheeks, and clasped Kathy's hand. Reverend Miles moved to stand beside them, his usual commanding presence humbled. "I too bear scars," he said quietly. "Not on my flesh, but on my soul. Years ago, I baptized Kathy in secret, then remained silent when she faced persecution. My cowardice haunts me." He turned to face the townspeople directly. "Never again will I stay silent in the face of injustice. Never again will fear rule over faith." Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. "You are free to go, Mrs. Yazzie. Private Wilson will help gather your belongings." Outside the fort, a group of ranchers had gathered on horseback, including Jim Henderson and old Tom Cooper. Their breath steamed in the cold morning air as they waited. "We'll ride with you," Henderson called out as Kathy emerged into the sunlight. "Make sure you get home safe." "And we aim to keep watching that spring, too. What threatens your water threatens all our herds." Sandro helped Kathy mount up, passing Samuel carefully into her arms before swinging onto his own horse. The boy was still weak, but his eyes were bright as he looked around at their impromptu honor guard. The small procession moved out from Fort Garland, hooves crunching through fresh snow. Sheriff Drummond watched them go from the shadows of the gate, hatred plain on his face, but he made no move to follow. They rode slowly, mindful of Samuel's condition. The winter sun climbed higher, making the snow-covered landscape sparkle. Kathy found herself remembering other rides along this trail, first fleeing in terror, then returning in chains. Now she rode freely, her head held high, surrounded by allies instead of enemies. When they crested the final ridge leading to Sandro's homestead, Kathy caught her breath. The cabin lay in ruins, just as the soldiers had left it. Blackened timbers thrust up from the snow like accusing fingers. The door hung crookedly on one hinge, and the roof had partially collapsed. The ranchers muttered angrily at the sight of such senseless destruction. But Sandro urged his horse forward, leading them down to what remained of his home. He helped Kathy and Samuel dismount near the still-standing corner of the cabin. "We'll help you rebuild," Henderson offered immediately. "Got plenty of good timber on my land." "Much obliged," Sandro replied quietly, his eyes fixed on the ruins. The ranchers didn't linger long, knowing the small family needed time alone. They rode off with promises to return the next day with supplies and helping hands. Soon, only the three of them remained, standing in the snow before the wreckage of what had briefly been their sanctuary. Samuel pressed against Kathy's side, shivering slightly. Sandro immediately shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. Kathy moved forward slowly, her boots crunching in the snow. She reached out to touch one scorched wall, then turned to face Sandro. Their eyes met in perfect understanding. They had both lost homes before, had both risen from ashes. "We can build again," she said softly, holding out her hand to him. "Together." Sandro's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "Together," he agreed. Working quickly in the fading light, they cleared a space near the cabin's remains. Sandro gathered wood while Kathy and Samuel arranged stones in a circle. Soon, a cheerful fire blazed, pushing back the gathering shadows. Their meal was simple: dried beef, the last of Mary Crawford's bread, and hot coffee brewed in Sandro's battered tin pot. But as they huddled close to the flames, sharing the food and watching the stars emerge above the mountains, Kathy felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her. Samuel dozed against her shoulder, exhausted but healing. Sandro added another log to the fire, sending sparks dancing upward like fireflies. The ruins of the cabin loomed behind them, but its darkness couldn't touch the small circle of warmth they had created. Here, in this moment, they were home. Not in the walls that had burned, but in each other. In the trust that had grown between them, in the strength they had found together, in the future they would build from these ashes. The fire crackled softly, its light catching the silver threads in Kathy's dark hair and the proud lines of her face. No longer hidden, no longer afraid. Sandro watched her across the flames, his scarred features gentle in the firelight, and knew that his long solitude was finally ended. The mountain winter slowly yielded to spring's first whispers. Each morning brought new helpers to the homestead, wagons creaking up the ridge loaded with fresh-cut timber and determined neighbors. Jim Henderson's team of horses dragged massive pine logs into place, while Tom Cooper's boys helped strip bark and shape joints. Sandro worked tirelessly, his scarred hands steady on saw and hammer. He'd built this cabin once alone. Now he found himself surrounded by willing hands and cheerful voices. The walls rose steadily, stronger than before, as if the very beams absorbed the community's support. "Reckon we'll have you under roof before the spring rains?" Henderson called out, wiping sweat from his brow despite the lingering chill. "Mary's already planning what to bring for the housewarming." Kathy watched from where she sat in the sunshine, her fingers working steadily at her weaving. Strips of cloth, some faded and some bright, slowly took shape into simple curtains. Samuel had helped her gather the scraps from generous neighbors, Mrs. Cooper's faded calico, trimming from Mary Crawford's new dress, even pieces of old army blankets that somehow found their way to them. "Mama, look what I found." Samuel's voice rang out clear and strong as he trotted up with his arms full of smooth river stones. The pallor of illness had faded from his cheeks, replaced by healthy color. "These will be perfect for the new hearth." "They surely will," Kathy agreed, touching each stone as Samuel laid them proudly at her feet. "Your father would be proud to see you helping build our new home." Samuel's smile dimmed slightly at mention of his father, but then brightened again as he glanced toward where Sandro worked. The boy had taken to following the mountain man like a shadow, watching intently as Sandro demonstrated how to notch logs or set stone. Reverend Miles rode up the trail, his wagon loaded with more supplies. He visited often now, bringing not just physical aid but spiritual comfort as well. This morning he carried his worn Bible and a packet of seeds from his wife's garden. "The Lord provides new beginnings," he said, settling beside Kathy with a grunt. "Like these seeds, what looks dead in winter brings forth life in spring." He opened his Bible, finding a marked passage. Isaiah tells us, "Remember not the former things, nor consider the things of old. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth, do you not perceive it?" Kathy's hands stilled on her weaving. "New things," she repeated softly. "Yes, I begin to see them." The evidence was all around them. Sarah Henderson's little girl played chase with Samuel, their laughter floating on the breeze. Mrs. Cooper had brought fresh bread yesterday, staying to share coffee and conversation. Even the sheriff's wife had nodded politely when they passed in town. Old prejudices didn't die easily, of course. Some townsfolk still crossed the street to avoid her. Whispers sometimes followed Samuel at the general store. But more and more, Kathy found acceptance. Not universal, but growing steadily like spring grass pushing through melting snow. The days fell into a rhythm. Sandro rose before dawn to hunt or check his trap lines. Kathy cooked breakfast over the campfire, teaching Samuel traditional prayers as they worked. Neighbors arrived to help with construction, sharing news and coffee between tasks. By evening, everyone would gather to admire the day's progress before heading home. Samuel thrived in this new routine. He helped gather stones for the hearth, learning their Apache names from Kathy and their English ones from Sandro. He played with the ranch children who came with their parents, no longer hiding at the sight of strangers. His nightmares grew less frequent, replaced by excited chatter about helping build their home. "See how straight I laid these?" he called to Sandro one afternoon, pointing proudly to a row of stones he'd arranged. "Just like you showed me." Sandro examined the work carefully, his scarred face creased in a smile. "Fine job, boy." Mighty fine job indeed. His hand rested briefly on Samuel's shoulder, a gesture becoming familiar between them. As the cabin took shape, Kathy found herself watching Sandro more and more. She noticed how he always seemed to know when Samuel needed encouragement, or when she grew tired, how his quiet strength supported them both without demanding or rushing, how his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking, full of something deeper than mere kindness. One evening, after the neighbors had gone home and Samuel slept deeply in their temporary shelter, Sandro approached where Kathy sat by the fire. His hands worked nervously at something small she couldn't quite see. "Been meaning to speak with you," he said quietly, settling beside her. "About our future." Kathy's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "What about it?" "This cabin we're building, it's meant for a family." He drew a deep breath. "I'd like it to be our family. Proper and legal-like." From his pocket, he drew out a simple wooden ring, carefully carved with a pattern of mountain flowers. "Will you marry me, Kathy?" She stared at the ring, trembling slightly. His words from their first meeting echoed in her mind. "Show me everything." He had seen her scars, her fear, her fierce protective love for Samuel, and still he wanted her, all of her. "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks as she smiled. "Yes, I will marry you." Sandro's hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he drew her close, holding her as if she were more precious than gold. They sat together by the fire, planning their future in quiet voices while the stars wheeled overhead. The news spread quickly through the community. Mary Crawford immediately began planning how to decorate the little church. Mrs. Cooper promised a wedding cake. Even the Reverend's wife offered to help Kathy sew a new dress for the occasion. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Reverend Miles said when they told him, beaming broadly. "Who would have thought that tragedy and persecution would lead to such joy?" Truly, he makes all things new. As twilight deepened that evening, Kathy stood in the doorway of their half-built cabin. The new walls rose strong and true around them, promising shelter and safety. Samuel slept peacefully nearby, no longer hiding underground, but resting easily beneath the stars. Her shawl lay folded inside, no longer needed to hide her scars. Instead, she walked unashamed into the circle of firelight where Sandro waited. The wooden ring on her finger caught the flame's glow, its carved flowers a promise of beauty yet to bloom. Light spilled from their lamplight onto the new walls, turning raw wood to gold. Outside, crickets sang their evening chorus, while inside, hope built itself beam by beam into a home. Here, finally, was a place where scars could heal, where trust could grow, where love could flourish in the good soil of acceptance and understanding. Spring came gently to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that year. Snow melted into rushing streams, feeding Canyon Spring until it burbled with newfound vigor. Fresh grass sprouted in patches along the chapel path, where Kathy now walked, her plain cream dress brushing the emerging greenery. Inside the one-room church, morning light filtered through simple glass windows, casting warm patterns across the wooden floor. Samuel stood proudly at the front, his small hand clasped firmly in Sandro's larger one. The boy's eyes shone with joy, his new suit carefully pressed for the occasion. Reverend Miles stood before them, Bible open in his weathered hands. His voice carried clear and strong through the chapel as he began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Kathy felt her heart flutter as she looked at her soon-to-be husband. Sandro's scarred face held such tenderness as he gazed back at her. His rough hands, accustomed to axe and saw, now held hers with infinite gentleness. The pews behind them filled with familiar faces, Mrs. Cooper dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, the Henderson family sitting straight-backed and solemn, ranchers who had helped rebuild their home nodding in approval. Even those who had once turned away now offered quiet smiles of support. "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things," Reverend Miles read, his voice carrying weight and meaning. "Love never fails." When the moment came for Sandro to lift Kathy's simple veil, his hands trembled slightly. Her scars were visible to all, but she no longer felt shame. Instead, she saw in Sandro's eyes what she had discovered that first night: acceptance, understanding, and deep, abiding love. Their kiss was tender, a promise sealed before God and community. Applause filled the small church, echoing off the walls as Samuel rushed to embrace them both. Kathy felt tears of joy slip down her cheeks as she held her son close, Sandro's arms strong around them both. They walked out into brilliant spring sunshine, Samuel running ahead down the chapel steps. His laughter carried on the breeze, pure and uninhibited. Flower petals scattered by well-wishers danced around their feet as they made their way to waiting horses. The celebration continued through the afternoon, but as evening approached, the new family rode home together. Their rebuilt cabin stood strong against the mountainside, smoke curling, welcoming from the chimney, where Mrs. Cooper had kept the fire going. Inside, the single room glowed with warmth and lamplight. The wooden table Sandro had crafted held their wedding supper, a hearty stew simmering in Kathy's mother's pot, fresh bread still warm from the town bakery, and a small cake decorated with spring wildflowers. They ate together, sharing stories and dreams, while twilight deepened outside the windows. Samuel's eyes grew heavy as he finished his portion, and soon he curled up by the hearth, sleep smoothing his features into perfect peace. Kathy and Sandro sat together on the bench he had built, their hands intertwined. Through the window they could see the first stars appearing above the mountains. The eternal peaks stood dark against the deepening sky, silent witnesses to this new beginning. "Come spring, we'll plant a garden," Sandro said softly, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Samuel can help tend it. Reckon we could grow just about anything in that good soil." "I'd like that," Kathy replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Herbs for medicine, vegetables for the table. My mother taught me about growing things." Sandro turned to her, his scarred face gentle in the lamplight. "You've shown me everything, Kathy," he whispered. "Your strength, your heart, your scars. And I choose to stay, today and all our days." She smiled up at him, feeling peace settle deep in her soul. The cabin glowed around them, every beam and board holding memories of community and healing. Samuel's quiet breathing mixed with the crackle of the fire, a lullaby of home. Outside, an owl called softly to the night. Inside, lamplight filled every corner of their sanctuary, warming the curtains Kathy had woven, gleaming on the stones Samuel had gathered, reflecting off the window glass neighbors had helped install. Here, within these walls built by many hands, a family had found its beginning. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.